as we have now come to readings of the book of the prophet Jeremiah, it might be interesting to note that in our Bible, the prophets sections is from longest to shortest, with the exception of the minor prophets, and they're written pretty much longest to shortest in that section, because I think it was based on the size of the scroll. So Isaiah is the longest, and Isaiah covers a long history. Jeremiah seems to be a much briefer time of history, and it is the time just before and after the coming of the Babylonians, and then the final captivity brought about by the Babylonians, and the final destruction of Jerusalem. Remember, towards the end of Isaiah was that time with Hezekiah and the coming of the Assyrians and the anxiety of Hezekiah and the complete destruction of the Assyrian army and its besieging of Jerusalem. And the Assyrians suddenly just pretty much disappear. But then Hezekiah entertains envoys from Babylon and shows them everything. And now the time between the Assyrians and the final Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem is about 135 years. But understand, in Jeremiah's time, probably, that period of the coming destruction of the Assyrians, and yet Jerusalem is spared and the Assyrians are gone, and Jerusalem and Judah seems to have a period of relative peace. They're still securing themselves by making treaties with other nations, and they still continue the worship of the Baals and the many gods of the nations around them that they're making treaty with. And then comes the word of the Lord to Jeremiah about 135 years later saying, yeah, destruction is surely coming now. Now, when destruction was threatened and then Jerusalem was spared, and of course in the conscience of the people that Jerusalem will always remain because it is the place of the dwelling place of the name of the Lord, and we can be protected by God even though we have broken the basic laws of God and not only gone after other gods but practiced oppression, and yet Jerusalem remains. Here comes Jeremiah to say, well, all that was foretold of Jerusalem's destruction is now going to come to be. He is treated as a traitor, and we'll hear more about his prophecy and his treatment. Now, it occurs to me to also make mention that both Isaiah in chapter 6 and then early in Jeremiah, we find that both Isaiah and Jeremiah were priests. So they grew up in a hereditary priesthood, and they serve in the city under the covenant, but serving in the city that has gone wrong for generations, and the people of God who have gone wrong for generations, and never actually received the full punishment that God has warned them about in all those years. It is likely that Jeremiah would have seen all these other idols around the Temple of Jerusalem and even around the holy place and in Jerusalem itself as normative growing up in a priestly family and serving as priest. And at some point, the word of the Lord comes to him, apparently as a very young man, and says, see, all this that's going on that's normative is terribly, terribly wrong. And I've given you the words, and do not be dismayed about what people say or threaten you with, because you have my word. As opposed to all these others who for generations, and even in your own generation, are practicing all these things. I mean, he's in a difficult situation, and yet he remains true, and God, again, through him, is explaining how stupid and false all these idols are, and how when you have the living God that has made covenant with you, it doesn't make any sense to trust the ordinances and commandments and traditions that are based upon man, that human beings have made, even in Jerusalem, for the protection of themselves that are against God. Why would you go against God? And so we'll hear more about Jeremiah. Understand, his prophecy is not from some stranger coming from without to say, you've all got it wrong. It's coming to him from God, and he is within. And maybe he's even taken part in the things that he has to denounce. And yet, even as terrible as this is and the coming destruction, there's a few, even early on, times where God says, but I will not destroy utterly. There's always a remnant. But we also hear Jeremiah's own anguish. He feels it in his heart and in his body, what the Lord is going to do. He grieves and mourns. And there are times where it hasn't happened yet, but it seems in the recording of what God has told him, he sees as though it has happened, and it hurts him bodily to know. Anybody who's a parent, when their own children have gone wrong or in pain, we feel the grief in our own bodies. One might say, well, it's psychosomatic. But there's that strong enough connection. And God feels it, and so does God's prophet Jeremiah, in a way, feeling and in his own body the destruction that is so sure. He has visions as though it's already happened. He hears the trumpet of the enemy coming. He hears the horses of their cavalry, even though it's not come yet. And yet he has to proclaim these things and be considered a traitor because he proclaims destruction when Jerusalem has been spared before, and everybody's trusting that it will be spared again. Now, for us, should we even speak against the church when it's gone wrong, when we've grown up into the church and its traditions have, we've been steeped in them, we've been taught by them, we even know the Lord through them? Should we, even though we've taken part in sin, proclaim when things have gone wrong and are against God, even in the church? Well, Jeremiah and others would say, well, yes, it's important that we confess our own sins, but because we have sinned does not mean that we don't speak against wrong, and it also doesn't mean that we continue in it if we've taken part. Do we have a right to speak? Well, no, but the Lord's truth is still truth. Even if we've taken part in the wrong, we need to speak it clearly. How else will people know? And how else will they know right repentance for forgiveness of sins if we don't also take part by confessing and trusting and know that God will keep God's covenant, even if we have to receive the pain of the discipline of the Lord in our own selves and mourn what happens to others when they refuse. We're still part of the people of God and still must speak the Lord's truth in love. And yes, he is just, and also his mercy and loving kindness never fails. I hope this is of help. Thank you.